Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community.
A very good morning and warm welcome once again to Money Sense. Your hosts this morning are Christophe Barnett. Morning, Christophe.
Good morning, Simon.
And myself, Simon Cordery. We're joined this morning by Anthony Travers. Tony is the former chairman of Cayman Finance, the managing partner of Travers Thorpe Alberga, and I think it's fair to say a well-known and vocal voice with respect to the Cayman Islands and its economic perspectives. Anthony, so once again, thank you very much for joining us and good morning.
Good morning. I've been wondering what 7:30 looked like for some time.
You've just got back from a vacation, so this must be doubly unpleasant for you, for which we apologise profusely, obviously.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here.
Well, I'm very glad you could join us. We are in interesting times. The world is full of unusual things happening. Politicians around the world are doing weird and wonderful stuff. Where does Cayman stand today in terms of its economic and competitive position? How does it stack up against the offshore competitors? What's going on in your perspective? What do we need to be worried about?
A number of things, I think. Post the financial crisis, certainly transactional flows are down significantly, particularly in the area of structured finance. So we whatever we do against that backdrop. The negative campaigning about Cayman has continued apace. So reputationally, we have great difficulty in certain areas of the world, particularly Europe.
Do you see that getting better? Has the pace continued at the same speed? Or
No, I really don't. Because if you look at the underlying agenda of a number of EU organisations, and let's remember that the OECD are effectively a Paris-based think tank that are an agency of the European Union, the agenda that they have, the long-term agenda that they have, is that low tax or preferential tax regimes should not exist at all. So to try and appease the OECD or EU institutions is a failed strategy. There's no way you can appease an alligator. If you give it your leg, it'll simply come back for another leg. So that negative publicity has, to answer your initial question, had a very serious bearing on our ability to market in Europe. It's also persuaded a number of Latin American institutions and organizations to become more Eurocentric and less offshore. America continues to favor Cayman by way of geographical proximity and long-established relationships, but transactional flows are down. Middle East remains a positive, and China and Tokyo remain positive. But the sands are constantly shifting in these areas, and we need to improve the quality of financial services and the range of financial services that we provide here to be taken more seriously.
You said that, I'm struck by one thing you said, which is that the OECD argument about the anxiety they have, and perhaps that's too mild a word in actual fact, with respect to low taxation. And yet when you look around the world today, you look at what the US is doing, this America First policy, some of the European countries are their country first. We're almost it seems as though we could almost go down a path of beggar thy neighbour sort of trade policies and beggar thy neighbour taxation policies, whereby you would lower your own domestic taxation. The Republicans in the US have talked about that. Ireland obviously has a say, and the UK has talked about a potentially 10-15% tax rate. Does the OECD risk becoming marginalised and irrelevant to the benefit of Cayman, perhaps? Or does the general reduction in taxation rates potentially harm the attractiveness of Cayman?
I don't think the OECD becomes marginalised, but you're right to identify a number of important issues. However, it is wrong to conflate the United States policy with respect to lower taxation, certainly under the Trump administration, with what is going on in Europe. Europe and the OECD remain heavily weighted in favour of very high levels of taxation. We are going to see a conflict there should President Trump succeed in revamping U.S. tax law. But the point that underlies your comments, Simon, is that actually what the U.S. administration is saying is that low tax rates work. And the OECD initiative is, in fact, fundamentally flawed. However, the EU remains a very, very powerful body and it can dictate who markets product within its boundaries. And effectively, Cayman is being cut out of that marketing initiative. Certainly ESMA has not approved the passporting and is unlikely to do so for our securities. And my own view is that it is a waste of time trying to appease the Europeans, because they are firmly entrenched in their views about low tax havens. And in fact, we can continue satisfactorily if we do another of other things correctly without Europe. And in fact, when you look at the statistics, you find that the hedge fund statistics, certainly, which we have available, you find that in fact Europe is not that important. Less than 8% of the investment in Cayman Island hedge funds, in fact, comes from EU based jurisdictions.
Do you think or find that the UK exiting Europe in the way it's planning on doing will be a positive or negative for Cayman, or is it too early to say at this stage?
Well, that's the point. When you say exiting in the way they're planning on doing, no one knows what they're planning on doing. And I think you can waste a great deal of time at this stage talking about Brexit, because until we have some hard copy on exactly what the UK wants to make of itself as a global financial centre. And let me say, if I were directing UK policy, there are huge opportunities for the UK if they were to move in the right direction with regard to low taxation and the rest of it. Low taxation, low regulation. It's by no means certain at the moment that they're going to go in that direction. And everything we've seen from the UK recently in terms of policy, particularly beneficial ownership registers, is actually very, very harmful to offshore structuring, and indeed, I think it's harmful to the prospects for the City of London going forward as a financial centre. What seems to have been lost in that debate is there is a legitimate right to privacy, and certainly our politicians, I think, have been too fast in signing up to initiatives which are by no means a global standard, and which are likely to become the outlier rather than the core of global policy as it moves forward.
What I'm hearing from you is the landscape in which Cayman is competing, in which Cayman is operating, is not getting easier. It's increasingly challenging.
That's correct. No, absolutely, that's correct.
Where we have elections coming up ourselves here in Cayman, and obviously the influence that we can make is, despite perhaps what we often hear, is probably more limited than we would like to believe. Our ability to change things is we're more of a passive receiver of what goes on in the world, but there are things we can do. What do you find to be some of the things that have been talked about as we lead up to the election, and policies that have been enacted and been talked about? Where do you get the most concern, and perhaps where are you most optimistic?
Well, I think it all distills down to one core point, and that is the quality of financial services and the range of financial services that the island can provide, because now we are competing on a global stage. There are many, many other jurisdictions which have similar legislation, so that edge has been lost. And so it simply comes down to the question of what quality can you provide, because you're right. The determination of whether we are a successful financial centre or not is made in the minds of the clients at the other end of the funnel, and not in the Cayman Islands. All you can do here is try to provide the highest quality services. And this distills down to one point, and that is whether you are going to have an enlightened immigration policy which brings into the island the very highest quality of professionals across the range, not simply lawyers, but accountants, investment bankers, merchant bankers, traders, fund administrators, the whole essential toolbox that is necessary to build a successful financial industry. Whether you're going to introduce those people with an enlightened immigration policy, or whether you are going to say to them, no, we have very, very strict work permit requirements. We can't tell you in 2 years whether you're going to be here. We can certainly tell you in 8 years you're not going to be here. And if you keep that up, what you're really saying is, what quality of financial services on a global platform can an island population of 25,000 people produce? If you start to impose protectionism in relation to financial services, you're really looking at the question of how many skilled professionals can a very small island population actually manage to qualify and introduce into the financial services area, and that is a very, very challenging point that hasn't been properly examined.
I want to put the alternative argument to you. Some people who are listening to this will say immigration is a hot topic, not just in Cayman. Let's be honest, it's been a hot topic in Germany, it's been a hot topic in the Netherlands, in the US, in the UK, Australia. Almost every country, immigration has been a concern of the voting population. People will say, well, for the last 8 years, Cayman has grown exponentially. You drive down the road and it's busy. You look at all the construction going on. You look at all the number of people with jobs, all the rest of it. That's against a backdrop of the rollover policy. That's against a backdrop of work permits existing. That's against all these backdrops. How can we be sure what you're saying is correct in that context?
Well, I think you're generalising. We've been very fortunate to have the dark corporations spend $2 or $3 billion. I don't know what the exact numbers are here, and a lot of what you are seeing in terms of construction and busyness can be attributed to that local development of the tourism industry by the dark corporation, which is clearly a positive. But if you look at the statistics on financial services, they are declining. So I think it is a mistake to simply say there's a lot of traffic on the road, we're doing fine. That's not the case. If you look at financial services, we used to have 450 banks. We're down to 160. Even captive insurance companies are down from 740 to 700. They're declining. Mutual funds, assets under management pre-crisis with 3.5 trillion. They're now 2.3 trillion. They're down. Company and corporations have gone pretty much nowhere in 2 decades. But bear in mind, 50% of government revenue comes from financial services, some $350 million a year. Government expenditure is going up. There is no other viable source of revenue for government other than financial services. Tourism produces some money. No doubt the local construction by dark corporation has improved the local statistics to an extent, but nothing like the $350 million number. That number needs to be going up, not down. And it isn't.
Now, we're going to take a short break in a couple of moments, and I definitely want to talk with you about some of those policies you allude to, whether it be how to solve that problem. Should rates for financial services come down? Should work permit costs go up, go down? But just before we go to a break, we had talked about the perception or the decision-making. The decision-making process for using Cayman is made elsewhere. Do you think that we who live and work here, whether we be locals, whether we be expats, are naive about that fact? Do you think that we fully reconcile in our own minds that actually is the case? Or are we actually just accepting of the fact that business happens and just a little bit too naive about the fact that it does happen?
I would say there is a very high level of naivety about the precise mechanics by which transactional flows are brought to the Cayman Islands. And I think we've seen that naivety demonstrated in the recent debates in the House in terms of protectionist legislation and what that might do to financial services. I do not think there is a real understanding or a good understanding of how transactions come to Cayman in the first place.
How do we solve that?
I don't think you can solve it.
Is it an educational aspect? Is it we all need to go out on the road and present to people in forums? What's the solution to that?
Well, there is no doubt that considerable efforts have been made to explain those points to various governments in which I have been involved. But if politicians don't understand and aren't listening, the answer is you can't solve the problem.
Sure. Well, we're going to end on that. We're going to pause on that particular note for a 2-minute break, and then when we come back, we're going to talk with you, Tony, just about policies and solutions to some of the problems that we face in Cayman today. So join us in 2 minutes after the break.
This is
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community. Brought to you by the CFA Society Cayman Islands and sponsored by One Trade X.
And now, more Money Sense.
Welcome back. In the second half of today's show, we are going to continue our conversation with Tony Travers about the state of the Cayman Islands its economic situation and what should or could be done with respect to political decisions as we approach the upcoming election season. Before the break, Tony, we had talked about you had mentioned that perhaps your biggest anxiety or opportunity, I guess an anxiety often becomes an opportunity, is the state of the immigration policy here in Cayman. Can you give us an example, a tangible example, a real-life example that's happening right now that sort of addresses this particular point and why that's a concern? So the policy decisions that are going through legislative, we've got the legal practitioners bill. Is that part of your concern with respect to immigration and what the politicians are thinking of here?
Yes, I would say I'm very troubled by it. The last politician who endeavoured to nationalise legal services in relation to the financial services industry was called Lyndon Pindling. And that had a catastrophic effect in 1972 in the Bahamas. I mean, most of our politicians today are too young to have been around at the time.
And our radio host, to be clear.
and your radio host. I sadly am not too young to have been around at the time. However, endeavours of that sort, expropriation of legal services in that way have never worked well. They didn't work well in the Bahamas. In fact, they were catastrophically damaging in the Bahamas, which never recovered. They didn't work well in Bermuda, were as damaging there. So this kind of policy may play well to the local voting population, but it isn't going to play well in the major financial centres of the world. And that is where the decision making is made. It's going to be far too easy now to say, and in fact questions have been made to me by clients already, is Cayman going the same way as the Bahamas? So the problem with protectionism is, yes, you can apply protectionism in relation to a local economy. If you want to protect your taxi drivers, you can absolutely apply protectionism. If you want to protect your local restaurants and say only Caymanians do it, only Caymanians can provide restaurants, yes, you can do that. Some would say it doesn't have a long-term beneficial effect on the quality of the service. Protectionism never does. But nevertheless, you can do it with a local economy. What has never been done anywhere in the world is to try and apply protectionism to a financial services industry where the decision-making as to whether you use Cayman or not is not made locally. Because you cannot control by Cayman Island legislation the decision-making that happens in London, New York, Beijing, Shanghai, Bahrain, Dubai.
Now, you used the word nationalism of the legal profession.
Yes.
That's to some people, that would seem, well, maybe some people wouldn't understand what the word means. To some people who grew up in the 70s and they saw nationalisation in certain parts of the world of industries, that has very disturbing connotations.
Well, it does, unfortunately. But when you see a headline in the Cayman Compass that says the minister wants law firms to be owned 60% by Caymanians within a certain number of years, there's no other word for it. We may as well call it like it is. That is nationalism.
So is the problem you're identifying there's a lack of suitably skilled Caymanians to fill those positions? Is that the problem, or are we talking about a subtlety on this?
Well, I think the problem comes about. Let me declare my interest in this. I drafted the first legal practitioner's law for government in 2004-05. I've since spent hundreds, if not thousands of hours drafting two further versions of what would have been a suitable law. And I have to say I'm extremely discouraged by what I have read in the newspaper, because no one has actually seen a bill, in respect to which I gather there are some 200 amendments being negotiated in secret. So subject to that caveat that nobody actually knows what the legislation says. Yes, I'm extremely troubled, because if you apply global statistics, these aren't my statistics, but they're publicly available, and look at the number of professionals that an island population of 25,000 people, 30,000 people can produce, you actually find it distills down to 30 to 40 college-level graduates a year, out of which the Cayman Islands would have to provide for its doctors, its accountants, its lawyers, its architects, all its professionals. So if we take just a rule of thumb to that and say maybe an island population of 25,000 is producing 5 or 6 lawyers a year of the requisite quality, that is nothing like the number that you would need to produce a world-class financial services centre and to maintain it and to impress clients
and
that they should use you.
So that's an important... What I'm hearing from you is an important distinction between saying Caymanians aren't qualified. You're saying there can't possibly ever be enough possible qualified Caymanians because of the small population that we start from.
Well, if you apply the global statistics, that is absolutely the case. And there's been a lot of debate in the House about some abusive behaviour in relation to a number of young Caymanian attorneys, and I've absolutely no doubt that there were abuses. But the interesting thing about those abuses, which I know of 2 or 3 very specific cases, and I think everyone knows the names, is that they occurred at a time where we had an immigration law and we had a business staffing plan law that was supposed to prevent those abuses occurring, and yet Caymanians didn't do what they ought to have done to protect those Caymanian interests. And now we have a backlash with some very, very aggressive legislation proposed, I gather, which is going altogether too far in the wrong direction. And in all of that debate, Simon, the one thing that actually hasn't been discussed is this. Law firms are like any other business. They operate on the basis of fundamental economics. If there is any lawyer out there, and I don't care what their background is or where they come from, if there is any lawyer out there in Cayman that can generate $1 million to $2 million a year in fee income, it will vary depending on the sort of firm they're in, but in that range, $1 million to $2 million of income, who isn't a partner of a law firm, they can come and see me on Monday morning, and they don't need an appointment, just walk in, say, is Tony in? That will be fine, and they will be a partner by lunchtime. If the lawyers in question are not producing $1 million to $2 million a year in fee income, there is no way they can be partners of a law firm. And that is the one economic point that has not been raised at all in any of the debates in the House.
I guess there's an aspect to that, which is someone might say, well, when I was in my career, I perhaps wasn't given the opportunity to be able to get to that. I wasn't offered the right sort of clients. So there are some nuances there. But your point's well taken, Christoph. Sorry.
Well, I just wanted to go back to your point about the development of business and the choice of Cayman as a jurisdiction by the ultimate clients, because we fall into this trap of history where we assume things have always been and will ever be. Yeah. When in fact we can look back and we have real examples of potential competitors that either shot themselves in the foot or engaged in policies that led to their demise and ultimately our success. So what did we used to do? What did happen to build up the jurisdiction? What policies do we need to go back to?
Or what policies do we need to get rid of? I suppose is another way of looking at the same question.
I think, that's very clear. In the old days, about which I can speak with some authority, and probably without fear of contradiction in this audience, in the old days, I think the very important thing, the crucial thing about Cayman politicians was that they knew what they didn't know, and they were perfectly prepared to admit it and seek advice. And I think that has changed dramatically, so that the input from those who do know in the private sector has been marginalised or reduced, and that of itself is a very material change. And the second thing I go back to is that the immigration policy, which we need to bring in the highest quality expatriates in financial services, has become less and less enlightened. We can go back to the rollover policy and the fact that we lost 1,000 jobs in fund administration. And interestingly, Christoph, 50% of those jobs were Caymanian jobs.
Sure.
They went to Nova Scotia, they went to Halifax. They went to Halifax, and we all know the story about that in financial services. So what those protectionist policies have done, perversely, is actually reduced opportunity for integration for young Caymanian professionals, not increased it. And this legal practitioner's law, if it is enacted in its current form and operates in its current form, will do precisely the same thing. It will reduce opportunities for young Caymanian lawyers, not increase them.
With respect to immigration, again, it is a hot topic in almost every country of the world, and the idea of allowing foreigners in is something that's anathema to many people for reasons that are too broad and too vast to begin to assess or analyse at this stage. But would a better policy in your mind be to scrap the immigration system and just allow in whoever wants, or are there some rules that need to be in place?
No, I think there are rules that need to be in place. If you look at the overriding concern of Caymanians with regard to immigration, it's that they should control their political process, and they should be given every opportunity with regard to economic advancement. Now, I don't think that professionals that come to the island need ever to be given Cayman status. I don't think they need ever to be given the right to vote. But they do need to know they can come here for the duration of their professional lives, bring their families, children, and integrate, and be given security of tenure. With some sort of extended work permit, lifetime permit, whatever it may be, some sort of permanent residence with the right to work. I mean, all of those things need to be developed further, but they don't need to have status, and they don't need to vote. And I think that covers the political aspect. And on the economic aspect, we have something called the Business Staffing Plan Board that is supposed, if it worked effectively, to secure economic advancement for Caymanians. The problem is it didn't work in relation to a number of celebrated cases with young Caymanian lawyers.
What's the solution then? I
think the solution is to take the pre-existing immigration law and business staffing plan and ensure it works, not to create new structures.
What was the reason it didn't work? Was it because it was staffed by the wrong people?
Well, I don't know. It would be too much of a leap for me to say that, to say why, in effect, those fairly egregious cases of discrimination against Caymanian lawyers were allowed to happen. Because certainly the politicians, the Business Staffing Plan Board, were aware they were happening at the time. But the interesting thing is, Caymanians did not step up to protect their fellow Caymanians at the time of those abuses.
Interesting. Well, we started the show saying we're going to talk about the general economic circumstances of Cayman and some of the general policies that are being promoted by various politicians. And within the space of 30 minutes, we've already managed to only cover a couple of topics. And that is the nature of a conversation like this, where we have some great in-depth discussion. I think it's incredibly valuable to hear different perspectives. We have to get you back on, though, Tony. When we see the prospectuses or the policy papers issued by the various parties, we'll have you on to launch a full barrage tirade against this or that, and we'll leave the politicians cowering.
I have always tried to stay out of the political process, Simon.
purely policy.
I'm happy to come back.
So, but anyway, Tony, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure having you on the show.
You're welcome.
So, as a final note, then, before we leave, I just wish to thank all of our listeners and remind you that today's show will be available as a podcast on the CFA Society Cayman Islands webpage, and encourage anyone who has a question to send us an email at moneysense@candw.ky, or, because we're so technologically advanced here, aren't we, Christoph? We are now at MoneySense Radio. We are twittered, whatever the verb of that is. Tweeting at MoneySense Radio. To do whatever it is Christoph just said. Be sure to follow us and post any questions or comments there. We will reply. With that, thank you once again. Goodbye, and please do tune in to MoneySense in 2 weeks' time.
MoneySense is brought to you with the support of OneTradeX. OneTradeX, the Cayman Islands' #1 choice for online brokerage.